Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. People in the West often get nervous when mention is made of Sharia law. They think of harsh punishments being meted out and rights being violated. Is there something wrong with the world's application of Sharia law? How can you get it right? Dr. Jasser Auda is a professor of Sharia at the Qatar Foundation and the head of training at the International Union of Muslim Scholars. He'll explain how to use the maqasid, or the higher purposes and intent of Islamic law, to get to rulings that achieve justice, equality, human rights, and development in today's context. Dr. Jasser, welcome to Let the Quran Speak. It's so nice to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Now, let's talk about Sharia law, which really is the big bad wolf in the West. People think of the Islamic law, Sharia law, as something very negative. There have even been proposals to ban it in the West. And you know, their fears are sometimes properly placed, right? Because in some parts of the Muslim world, you see Islamic law being practiced in a very horrible way, brutal way.
Yeah.
So what's going wrong here? Are we applying it wrong? Can you talk about that a little
We
bit?
are to a great extent. I think we should differentiate between Islam and Muslims. Islam could be understood via the Quran and via the tradition of Prophet Muhammad. Muslims could follow that, and they could follow their whims and their wrong interpretations and their wrong understanding. Sharia is the way, literally, which is the Islamic way of life. It is about ethics, it is about worship, and in the society it is about justice, and it is about common good, and it is about wisdom. And this is what every Sharia scholar said. We have wrong applications. That is part of the nature of the Sharia. The Sharia is divine, but the application is human, what we call fiqh, or understanding, or Islamic law. The Islamic law is a human law, but the Sharia is not Islamic law. The Sharia is a divine way of life, an ethical way of life.
So where have we gone wrong then?
We've gone wrong in two things. One, lack of understanding of the Sharia, from the principles, the basics, the purposes, the objectives, what we call in Arabic maqasid, because we have to understand the basics of the Sharia before we apply the Sharia. And the second point is a major educational crisis in the Islamic world, where lack of education and the failure of many educational institutes, or most educational institutes, cause a lot of ignorance, high percentage of illiteracy, etc. And therefore people take very simplistic views of the Sharia. These are the two issues.
Sometimes literalistic views of the Sharia.
Literalistic, yeah. Literalism is the easiest way of understanding anything. It's just to take the letter and try to follow the letter and all of that. But to understand the purpose, the objective, the wisdom behind the rule, to understand the rule as means to an end, and therefore be flexible with the evolution of the means and the diversity of the means in order to reach the same ends, is something that requires a certain level of education. And that's why perhaps I see the Muslim communities in the West more advanced than the Muslim communities, for example, where I came from in the Arab world, because of the educational crisis in the Arab world, and because of the good standard of education in the West. Muslims, being part of the society, are able to comprehend the objectives, the principles of the Sharia, and therefore live a more moderate life, a more reasonable and wise life amongst people who are non-Muslim, versus in the Arab world, where sometimes everybody is Muslim, but they still kill each other, and they still fight, and they still have major social problems because of the lack of understanding of the Sharia.
So can you give me an example of this? You advocate a maqasid-based approach to the Sharia. So can you tell us about how that would work and how it would be different from what has been practiced before?
Maqasid is the purposes, qasada yaqsid, purpose and objective of the Sharia, and therefore we are looking at what the Sharia is trying to achieve in people's lives. Ibn al-Qayyim, one of the great scholars of Islam, says Sharia is all about justice, all about wisdom, all about mercy, and all about good. Any rule that takes the Sharia from being about justice to being about injustice is a rule that does not belong to the Sharia, even if it's claimed to be so according to an interpretation, he says. This is kind of key in the work I'm trying to do, writing and speaking and teaching and also consulting for policy and all of that, and especially in the Middle East, where we need to move scholarship from wrong interpretations to correct interpretations. And we know how correct the interpretation is if the interpretation is going to be in line with justice and wisdom and mercy and common good. Common good being defined in that discipline as the preservation of life, preservation of mind, preservation of family, preservation of faith, preservation of wealth. These are principles that the Sharia is trying to achieve in people's lives. So the importance of that is that when we put the objectives as basis of our thinking of the Sharia, then we are not going to come up with rules or fatwas that are wrong.
So can you give me an example of that? Some, a ruling that would be different if we place maqasid or the goals, at the forefront.
Well, coming from the Arab world, we're very busy with this organization that calls itself the Islamic State, ISIS. And whenever they control a certain part of the land and they declare an Islamic State, they start to cut people's hands off and kill Christians and ban women from going to schools, etc., etc. The objectives of Islamic State in the Sharia are not like that. The objectives of Islamic State is what's called masalih al-nas, the public good. So the public good is not to close schools and punish people with these brutal punishments and all of that. The public good has to do with feeding the hungry and giving shelter to those who don't have shelter and giving education to people. Again, the preservation of mind, life, intellect, wealth, and all of that. So what they are doing is the total opposite of that. You find some scholars and some voices giving them legitimacy because what they are doing apparently looks like something that is Sharia compliant. This big beards and turbans and all of that.
And Islamic terminology, religious terminology that they're using as well.
Exactly, and they use these so they appear like they are Islamic just because they wear a turban and they wear a thobe. Even though at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, of course the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wore a turban and a thobe, but so did the disbelievers of Quraysh too. Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl wore a turban and a thobe. So it's not about that. What an Islamic state or an Islamic ruling or Islamic governance is about is the achievement of the best interest of the people. And they are not doing that, and therefore they are wrong, even if they call themselves Islamic. That is the importance of this. We see a lot of fatwas that are unfair to women, unfair to animals, unfair to society or non-Muslims, and etc. And these fatwas are wrong because they are not compatible with the principles of Islam. Even if they rely on some hadith, some saying of the Prophet ﷺ, and understand it in a twisted way. But the understanding is supposed to be subject to the fulfillment of the objectives. A big debate moving from the Arab world to Pakistan these days, a big debate on these apostasy laws in Pakistan because of the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said, whoever changes his religion, then kill him. That hadith is understood in a twisted way to mean that there is no freedom of religion in Islam. But there is, and there are many other verses of the Quran that says, La ikraha fi din, no compulsion in matters of religion. And there are many other examples from the tradition of the Prophet in which people change their religion, from Islam, I mean, to other religions. Inna alladhina amanu thumma kafaru. The Quran is talking about people who were believers and then they became kuffar, and then they became believers, and nobody had punished them. So they are not putting the hadith, if it is true anyway, and it's debated in terms of the historic authenticity of the hadith, they are not putting the hadith in the right context, and therefore they come up with a version of Islam that puts a sword on people's neck in order to say there is no God but one. But this is by definition a hypocrite in Islam. And
how do you decide which principles should take precedence? Because you mentioned some principles, I'm sure there are many others as well. They could contradict one another. So for example, you mentioned mercy and then you mentioned justice. Those are two different principles. So how can you be sure what the purpose is?
Well, there is a certain prioritization in this knowledge of maqasid or purposes in Islam. Like the scholars along history, and there is a long tradition of that, prioritize the objectives into what's called necessities or darurat, and then needs or hajiyat, and then luxuries, hasaniyat. We have to start with the necessities. And under the necessities, we have the preservation of life first, and then the preservation of mind, and then the preservation of family, and then the preservation of wealth. So wealth comes after family, and family comes after mind and intellect comes after life. This is prioritization. So therefore, if we have a contradiction between the preservation of life in the society and the preservation of wealth, we spend our money in order to preserve life. We compromise on matters of education in order to preserve life, and so on. So when the principles contradict, then we basically have to weigh what rule will achieve the maximum good for the society and minimize the evil or the mischief in a society. It depends. It's a case-by-case ethical law that we have in Islam. It's not a rule that fits all.
And how do we decide what the purpose is? You talked about purposes. How can we figure out, if we look at the Quran and Hadith, where do we go from there?
Well, scholars figured out this hierarchy of purposes by surveying the Quran and the tradition of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, looking for the principles. So when you survey the Quran, you will find that justice is one of the principles, not just in the rules that talked about different rulings, but also in the stories, in the talk about the afterlife. Everywhere in the Quran you will find justice. Everywhere in the Quran you will find mercy, and you will find wisdom, and so on. So these things are principles that the scholars surveyed what we have in the texts of the Quran and the tradition of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in order to find. And there is a long history of that. Now that we established the principles, we should take the principles and read the Quran through the principles. The problem is that we read the Quran sometimes verse by verse, sometimes half of a verse. When we used to memorize word by word, when we used to memorize the Quran, the Shaykh would ask us to recite the verses sometimes from the middle of, not just the verse, from the middle of the word. Sometimes we look in a very partialistic way, sometimes reductionist way, at the Quran. But if we take a step back and look at the whole Quran as an instrument of achieving justice in a society, and wisdom and worship and all of these, then we understand Islam through this lens, and therefore we reject any wrong understanding of Islam. And we call it wrong because it contradicts with the principles.
How would you respond to criticisms that you're watering down Islam?
It depends on what they mean by Islam. No, of course, we need to differentiate between the fixed matters in Islam and the variable matters. And anything that compromises the fixed matters in Islam are things that are unacceptable.
Well, some people would say, like introducing, things like freedom, talking about things like freedom, equality, those are Western concepts, and you're introducing them into Islam.
Well, no. Well, equality, the first person in history who talked about the equality of human beings is Muhammad, when he said that people are equal like the tooth of a comb. This is the first man known in history who talks about the equality of human beings, not just men or knights or whatever. It's talking about everybody. No, equality is an Islamic concept. Now, there are manifestations of equality in the Western cultures that contradict with the principles of Islam. In Islam, for example, in a family, men are not equal to women and women are not equal to men. Islam envisions a family in which men and women have different priorities. Both of them could do everything, but women have more priority to the care of the younger ones and so on. And it appears in a number of rules when it comes to the family law, etc. And men have priority of making a living for the family and so on. This is a natural structure that Islam envisions, of course. Now, there are cultural problems here in which people take this too far to mean that man is better than women or men. Of course not. Everybody is equal in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in front of the Sharia. But sometimes men and women have different roles. So what I'm saying is that we agree, Islam and Western culture and any rational culture, with the principles, but sometimes the applications have to be thought of in a deeper way than what we usually think. But this is not watering down of Islam, because this is Islam. These are the fixed matters in Islam. Justice is the fixed matter in Islam, not the small fatwas and all of that.
Dr. Jasser, Auda, I really appreciate your being on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.